The man arrived with the dying sun at his back, and not a soul in Dusty Creek could say where he'd come from or where the road ahead would take him. He didn't slow his horse at the tavern, didn't glance toward the bank. He rode straight through town, past the chapel, past the little schoolhouse, past the trading post, like none of it existed. He only pulled his reins when he reached a modest whitewashed farmhouse at the far edge of the Calloway property, where a woman stood waiting on her front steps with a shotgun she barely knew how to hold. She was half a breath from firing blind when the rider raised both hands, slowly, deliberately, and said, "Ma'am, word reached me you needed somebody who could repair fences and keep his nose out of other people's affairs. I'm your man on both counts." That was it. That was every word he spoke. And somehow, for Catherine Calloway, it was enough. She didn't know his name yet. Didn't know his age, though the silver threading through his hair suggested a man somewhere past 50. She couldn't have known that the stillness behind his eyes wasn't exhaustion. It was something harder won than that. The peace of a man who had long ago made his terms with violence, accepted them, and prayed every morning since that he'd never be called back to honor them. What she did know was this. In 3 days, a man named Silas Dorn was riding out to seize her land, and she needed someone, anyone, willing to stand between her and the storm that always traveled in men, like his shadow. But before this horse runs any further, if you're someone who loves a story about a quiet man who turns out to be anything but, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ride with us here at West Wild Classics. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from tonight. Then settle in, because this one is going to catch you off guard more than once. Catherine Calloway was 37 years old and had been a widow for nearly 2 winters. Her husband Robert had been taken by a fever that 3 different doctors from neighboring counties couldn't break. She'd laid him to rest on the hill behind the cattle shed, beside 2 small graves that belonged to children who never made it past. Their first year, she'd kept the ranch breathing, on her own ever since, through hard seasons and harder loneliness, with nothing but backbone, a revolving door of seasonal workers, and a kind of stubbornness that the townsfolk talked about in low voices they mistook for admiration. The property was called Red Bend 380. Acres of rich pasture and reliable water sitting, directly in the path of what Silas Dorn intended to build. A cattle corridor, stretching from the southern border all the way to the northern railhead. He'd already swallowed 4 ranches to make it happen. Some sellers came willingly. Others needed convincing. Red Bend was the final piece, the one that locked the whole route together. He'd offered Catherine $600 for land worth 3 times that. When she turned him down flat, the offers stopped. The pressure started instead. Fences cut in the night, a water trough poisoned. 3 of her hired hands roughed up on the road back from town and given a clear message. This land was cursed ground for any man who wanted to keep his teeth. By the evening the stranger appeared at her gate. Catherine had 1 worker remaining, an old man named Hatch, pushing 72, who squinted at everything beyond arm's length and probably shouldn't have been holding a rifle in the first place. She had a dead husband, a failing ranch, memories she couldn't afford to walk away from, and 72 hours before Silas Dorn came to collect what he'd already decided was his. "You have a name?" she asked the rider, lowering the shotgun but keeping it in her hands. "People call me Roe," he said. "Roe what?" "Roe Callahan." He paused the way some men do when a simple question carries more weight than it should. "It's the name I answer to." She should have turned him away right there. A man who treated his own name like something borrowed wasn't someone you handed your future to. But there was something in the way he sat his horse, unhurried, rooted, calm, and in the way his eyes swept her property without appearing to sweep it at all, reading every corner of it like a surveyor who'd done this work in his sleep. That told her this was a man who had seen exactly this kind of situation before. Many times. Probably more times than she wanted to think about. "I can offer $12 a month and a place to sleep," she said. "That's everything I've got." "I'm not here to negotiate," he said simply. He repaired the fence line that first evening without being told which sections were broken. He cleaned the water trough without being told it had been tampered with. And when old Hatch pressed him over supper, salt pork, beans, not much else, about how a wandering fence hand had learned to read a property's vulnerabilities like a battlefield commander, Roe Callahan said only, "A man picks things up over the years. and shifted the conversation to the likelihood of rain. Catherine watched him from the porch as night settled in. This stranger moving through her barn with a lantern, checking the horses, testing the door latches, attending to things that needed attending to that she hadn't thought to mention. She caught herself wondering, not for the first time, whether Providence occasionally sent its answers in worn-out boots and borrowed names, or whether desperation had simply made her willing to trust the first capable set of hands that appeared at her gate. She had 3 days to find out which it was. The following morning, 2 of Dorn's men rode up the drive to look the place over. Catherine recognized them immediately, a pair called Hagen and Cruz who handled most of Dorn's unpleasant business when their employer preferred not to be directly associated with it. They stayed in their saddles, looking the ranch over the way buyers survey livestock they consider already purchased. "Mrs. Calloway," Hagen called out, touching the brim of his hat with rehearsed courtesy. "Mr. Dorn wanted you to know the offer's still breathing. $600, peaceful departure, no hard feelings." "Your boss fouled my water," Catherine said from the doorway. "Destroyed my fencing. Had my men beaten half to death on an open road? We're well past hard feelings," Cruz grinned. "Country life's unpredictable. Accidents find people who stay where they're not welcome." That was when Rowe walked out of the barn. He was wiping his hands on a piece of cloth, unhurried, like a man with the whole afternoon ahead of him and not a worry to fill it. He didn't speak at first. He just stood there. And something in the particular way he stood, the stillness of it, the weight, made both horses step sideways beneath their riders. The way animals sometimes register a thing before the men on their backs have figured out what they're feeling. "Who's this?" Hagen asked, his hand drifting slightly toward his hip. "New hand," Catherine said. "He minds the fences." Rowe looked up at the 2 riders. Something old passed briefly through his expression, something that had lived there a long time and knew the neighborhood well. "You 2 ought to ride back," he said quietly. "Tell your employer the lady's keeping her land." Cruz laughed, though it came out a note or 2 thinner than intended. "You making threats, old man?" "No," Rowe said. "Just stating what's true. Same as I would for anyone." The brothers traded a look. The kind men share when something feels wrong, but they can't explain the feeling to themselves, let alone each other. Then Hagen spat in the dirt, yanked his horse around, and both men rode back toward town without another word exchanged. Hatch, watching from the porch rail, gave a slow whistle. I've known Cruz to start a fight with his own reflection. Never once seen him walk away from one. Rowe went back into the barn like nothing had taken place at all. That evening, Catherine found him on the porch steps, working a revolver she hadn't known was part of his belongings. An old Colt, clearly well-traveled and carefully maintained. The kind of weapon a man keeps within reach for reasons he doesn't talk about at supper. She sat beside him, close enough for conversation, far enough to leave herself room to have been wrong about everything. "You're not a drifter," she said. "No," he said. "I'm not. Then what are you?" He turned the cylinder slowly in the moonlight, inspected each chamber the way someone checks something they've checked 10,000 times and still don't entirely trust. "I used to hunt men," he said at last. "Bounty work mostly. Some territory marshaling when the law needed a body and wasn't too careful about which one. I had a gift for it. Probably a worse gift than I ever understood at the time. Built a reputation I didn't ask for and couldn't leave behind no matter how many state lines I crossed." "What kind of reputation?" "They called me the Spectre of the Brazos," he said. "No pride in it. Only the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying a heavy thing across rough ground for years and couldn't remember what it felt like to put it down. 49 men, ma'am. 49 men I ended in the course of that work. Some had it coming more than others. Every one of them is equally gone." Catherine didn't speak. She let that number settle. "Why did you stop?" "Because I got tired of being the reason good women became widows," he said. "Tired of watching what that kind of work carves out of a man, even when the law says he was right to do it. I set down my gun 7 years ago. Been moving since. I'm taking honest labor, mending things instead of breaking them. And now?" He looked out across the dark fields. The fence lines he'd repaired, the trough he'd cleaned, the small, stubborn piece of the world that Catherine Calloway had refused to surrender. "Now I think I've got one more stand left in me," he said. "Because a man ought to plant his feet for something before he's too old to stand at all. And this seems like as worthy a thing as I'm likely to find. Before we ride into what tomorrow brings, If this story's already got its grip on you, go ahead and press that like button. And if you haven't joined us at West Wild Classics yet, tonight's the night. Tell me in the comments what part of the world you're listening from. I love seeing how far these old trail stories carry. Stay close now, because sunrise changes everything. Silas Dorn had the story of Hagen and Cruz's retreat before midday. And before sundown, someone had given him the name Roe Callahan. Though it meant nothing to him yet, Dorn was a man built for business. Intimidation was his second tool. Violence was the last resort he rarely needed because nearly everyone folded before he reached for it. He rode out to Red Bend on the morning of the third day with 7 riders behind him, Hagen and Cruz included, who told their boss just enough about the strange stillness of the new hired hand to make Dorn curious rather than cautious. Catherine stood on her porch, shotgun in hand. Old Hatch beside her, rifle trembling at his side. Roe stood a few paces ahead of them both in the open yard, hands relaxed, watching the approaching riders with the patience of a man who had watched 100 arrivals just like this one. Dorn pulled up 30 feet out. He was younger than Catherine had imagined, perhaps 43, well-dressed for frontier business, the kind of man whose gloves stay clean because he employs people to soil theirs. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, tipping his hat with the same polished false courtesy his men had borrowed from him. "I see you've secured some protection. Smart. A woman in your situation ought to look after herself." His eyes settled on Roe, measuring, unimpressed. A man past his prime in dusty clothes. But hired help only goes so far when it's standing in front of 7 armed men. I'd encourage you to think carefully about which side of this you want to be on. "I'm standing right here," Roe said. "Same place I'll be when this is finished." Dorn's smile went flat. "You have no idea what you're stepping into." "Funny," Roe said. "I was thinking the same thing about you." Something in those words rippled through the group. Not panic, but something adjacent to it. A current of unease spreading horse to horse, rider to rider, like a cold draft through a room with no open window. "Final offer, Mrs. Calloway," Dorn said, returning his gaze to her. $600. Everyone rides home breathing. "My husband cleared this land," Catherine said. Her voice didn't waver. "His hands built every post on this property. You could offer me $6,000 and I'd give you the same answer." Dorn exhaled, the slow exhale of a man who finds sentiment to be an inefficient obstacle. He looked at Roe one final time. Something about the quality of the silence surrounding the man had begun, finally, to register as something outside ordinary calm. "I know you from somewhere," Dorn said slowly. "Where do I know that face?" "You don't," Roe said. "But men in your position usually think they do. Right about the time it stops mattering." Dorn's hand moved toward his holster, reflex more than decision, and then it was over, not dramatically. Not the way men picture it when they imagine violence from a comfortable distance. Real violence is sudden and economical and finished before the mind has caught up to the eyes. Roe moved. Not the flashy speed of a young man hungry to be witnessed, but the precise, stripped-down motion of someone for whom the draw had become as natural as breathing and just as free of wasted movement. His revolver cleared and fired before Dorn's fingers had closed around his own grip. The shot caught Dorn in the right shoulder and spun him hard from the saddle. Hagen reached next. Roe's second shot caught him in the forearm before the barrel had cleared leather. Cruz raised both hands without being asked. Something older and wiser than pride had taken over and made the calculation for him. The remaining 4 riders looked at their wounded employer crumpled in the dirt, looked at each other, and made the only sensible decision left available. They kept their hands exactly where they were. 4 seconds. Beginning to end. Catherine stood motionless on the porch, the shotgun hanging forgotten in her hands, staring at the man she'd hired 3 days ago to repair her fences. Roe reloaded, with the same unhurried ease he brought to everything else, and walked forward to where Dorn lay pressing his shoulder, with a gloved hand. "You're the Spectre," Dorn breathed. Understanding arrived through the pain like a wave. "Everyone said you were dead or gone." "Gone," Roe said. "This just needed finishing first." He crouched down and looked at the man directly. "You're going to leave this county. You're going to leave Mrs. Calloway and every rancher within 30 miles to live their lives in peace. Not because I've frightened you, though I have, but because if you come back, I won't be aiming for the shoulder." Dorn, pale and shaking and grasping at last the full size of the error he'd made, nodded. His men pulled him into his saddle, and the 8 of them made their way back toward town, quietly, slowly, and considerably less than they'd arrived. "You could have put him in the ground," Catherine said. "I could have," Rowe agreed, holstering his revolver. "Didn't need to. A dead man becomes a cause. A man who's been beaten and embarrassed, in front of his own crew, remembers the lesson every morning. He wakes up." Old Hatch set down his rifle and exhaled a breath he'd apparently been holding since the riders appeared. 49 men, he murmured to no one in particular. Lord have mercy. Sheriff Dawes rode hard from town within the hour, having heard the shots carry across the flatland and expecting to find catastrophe. Instead, he found a wounded cattle baron making his retreat and an older drifter on Catherine Calloway's porch steps, cleaning a revolver with the composure of a man who'd just finished routine chores. "Roe Callahan," the sheriff said slowly, studying the face like a man trying to locate a memory in a crowded room. "Heard that name one time. Deputy Marshal up in Nebraska told me about a bounty hunter down south who cleared 3 counties of the worst outlaws the territory had seen, then disappeared entirely." "Man's got a right to walk away," Rowe said. "Reckon he does," Dawes said, and something like genuine respect settled into his voice. "Dorn won't file a complaint. Man's too proud to document his own humiliation. But you and I ought to talk about what happens from here, because men with your particular history don't stay beneath the surface for long. Trouble knows where to find them even when they stop going to find it." "I know it," Rowe said. "Maybe stop letting it find you somewhere else," Catherine said quietly. Both men turned. "You said yourself that a man ought to stand for something before he's done standing. Maybe standing right here, for this land, for this town, is worth more than all those years of running ever gave you." Rowe was quiet for a long while. His eyes moved across the repaired fences, the clean water trough, the fields that would hold now against anything Silas Dorn might muster. "Maybe it is," he said. Word moved through Dusty Creek the way it always does in places starved for a story worth repeating. The specter of the Brazos, alive, retired, living quiet on the Calloway spread, had faced down Silas Dorn and 7 armed men and walked back to the porch without raising his voice. People came out to look at him, to measure the legend against the man. Most went away quietly disappointed because Roe Callahan looked nothing like a legend. He looked like an ordinary man in his 50s who fixed fences and stayed out of conversations he hadn't been invited into, which, as it turned out, was entirely the point. Silas Dorn sold his stake in the cattle corridor 6 weeks later and left the territory without ceremony, unwilling to gamble a second time against a man who'd answered him in 4 seconds flat. Red Bend stood. Its fences whole, its water clean, its future finally no longer in question. Rowe stayed on, not exactly as hired help, not after what had happened, though he never once asked for more than the $12 a month they'd first agreed on. He mended fences because the work kept his hands honest. He taught Old Hatch to shoot truer, and in the evenings, he sat on the porch beside Catherine while the light went golden over land that was, for the first time in 2 years, entirely at rest. She asked him once, long months after, why he'd stopped at her gate that first evening when a dozen other properties in the territory probably needed the same kind of help. "Wasn't looking for a fight," he told her. "Was looking for a reason to finally set down the one I'd been carrying so long it felt like part of my spine. Turned out this place gave me both." Catherine Calloway never remarried, not the way the town hoped she might. Though anyone who saw Roe Callahan and Catherine sitting together on that porch as the sun went down understood that some partnerships don't require a ceremony to be binding. He kept watch over that land for 12 more years, until his hands slowed and his eyes finally dimmed the way all things do eventually, and when he went, quietly, in his sleep, the way a man earns the right to go after enough hard years, the whole county came out to pay their respects. Because by then, everyone understood what Catherine had recognized from that very first evening, that the quietest men are often the ones who've already survived every war worth surviving and simply chose, at the far end of it, to spend whatever remained of themselves guarding something worth the cost. They laid him to rest on the hill behind the cattle shed, beside Robert Calloway and the 2 small graves that had been there longest. And Catherine had his stone carved with the only words she felt were honest enough: Roe Callahan. arrived as a stranger, left his kin, the fastest gun in Texas, and the last one standing who never wanted to be. If this story of quiet courage and old debts finally paid found something in you tonight, don't let it stop here. Hit that like button, subscribe to West Wild Classics if you're not already riding with us, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're tuning in from. I genuinely want to know how far these old stories travel. We come back every week with tales from the frontier. Stories about ordinary people who found something extraordinary inside themselves when the hour demanded it, and about the quiet men whose histories always caught up in the end, proving exactly who they had been all along. Until next time, friends, keep your fences standing and your word worth keeping. We'll meet you on the next trail.